program. The rant I wrote today for the Hartmann Report, yesterday afternoon, Louise and I always have a conversation when I get home from doing this program about, well, Tom, what are you going to write today? And this has been like boiling around in my brain for a couple of weeks now, mostly the last week, is that I keep seeing these stories on television, on cable TV news, where somebody in Ukraine is talking to an American reporter, and they tell the story of calling their relatives, their parents, their brother-in-law, their friend in Russia, and saying, you guys, Putin and his army are bombing the crap out of us. And the person in Russia on the other end of the phone goes, oh, no, I watch the news. I know that's not happening. Everything's good. It's a humanitarian effort. We're trying to protect the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. That's all we're doing. And then the commentator, the news reporter, on American television, basically has a look on their face like, how can these Russians be so stupid? And I want to push back on this. The Russian people are not stupid any more than the American people are stupid. There's a new poll that just came out from the independent poller Levada. I put a tweet about it in my op-ed today. You can see it at hartmannreport.com. Putin's popularity in January, Russia-wide, was 69%. This week, 83%. It's going up. Again, people say, well, Russians must be stupid. They must be idiots. How could they be more in favor of Putin? Well, let me ask you a question. Why is it that George W. Bush got reelected after he lied us into a war in Iraq? It took Americans years, at least 3 or 4 years, for the majority of Americans to realize deep down inside that George W. Bush had lied us into that war. And we're still in Iraq. I remember the Vietnam era. Now, I realize, many of you listening to me right now are not old enough to remember this, but I was a teenager during that time, and I remember it really, really well. And I remember when Daniel Ellsberg came out with the Pentagon Papers and said the whole thing was a lie. And here's the proof. McNamara, the defense secretary, lied to Lyndon Johnson for 2 weeks. McNamara wanted a war. And he told Lyndon Johnson that the USS, whatever it was, had been attacked at the Gulf of Tonkin, and he knew it wasn't true. But he had these intelligence cables that were like, we're concerned that this might, so he gives this to Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson goes out and tells the country, we're under attack in the Gulf of Tonkin in North Vietnam, or in Vietnam, and we've got to go to war against North Vietnam. And Johnson, for the first 2 weeks of the war, believed that McNamara was telling them the truth. It wasn't until the third week that Johnson discovered that he'd been lied to. But at that point, what's he going to do? So I remember my parents, friends of mine, not very many of them, but the circles I ran in, but I remember watching the news at night. How can Americans be so stupid as to believe that, A, we've got to go to war with another country because somebody hit one of our ships with a missile, and we're not even sure who it was who hit them. Well, it turned out the ship didn't even get hit. And B, that there's this wild domino theory that came out of Dr. Strangelove or something. I mean, really? And there were a lot of us who were looking at that, just like in 2003. I mean, Paul Loeb and I and Mark Crispin Miller were doing tours. I was traveling all around the country in 2003, giving speeches, mostly in churches and civic centers and things, about how Bush was going to try to lie us into a war in Iraq. And yeah, a lot of people figured it out before it even happened. And you had Scott Ritter, the American weapons inspector. He was with the UN, but he was an American. And you had Hans Blix, who was the Swiss, the head of the UN weapons inspection department, whatever it's called, going on national television saying, there's no weapons here. We have searched this country from one end to the other for a whole year. There's nothing here. And still, Bush and Cheney lied us into that war. And still, it got him reelected. It made him more popular. So, let's stop with the Russian people must be stupid rhetoric. And let's shift instead to asking the question, how do we prevent wars when we or Russia or any other country, I mean, this is a lesson I think we can apply to any country in the world, but let's put it in the context of America. In my lifetime, we've had two, arguably three. I mean, I'd throw Afghanistan in here because Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, offered to arrest bin Laden and turn him over to a third country. And George W. Bush said, oh, no, I want to have a war with you guys. You're the second poorest country in the world, just ahead of Burkina Faso. And we want to have a war. I've got to prove my wartime credentials, so I'm going to start bombing Afghanistan. We're going to bomb you back to the Stone Age. Doesn't matter that you're already in the Stone Age. Average income in Afghanistan was $700 a year. The gross national product, the GDP of Afghanistan when George Bush attacked them was $2 billion. This war has cost us $4 or $5 trillion. We could have taken $2 billion over to Afghanistan and given it to them and doubled the income of the whole country and said, hey, in exchange for this, give us bin Laden and his little merry band there. They would have jumped at it. But oh no, George W. Bush wanted a war. So how do we prevent this? Well, this is not an issue that has never come up before in American history. This is not an issue. In fact, the founders and framers of our Constitution were very aware of the possibility of this happening because they had seen throughout European history prior to 1787, they had seen all kinds of wars being started because kings were were unpopular domestically, and they thought, hey, a little war will make me more popular. They had seen it over and over. They'd seen it in their lifetimes. They knew European history. They knew, all over the world, you've seen this. And so in 1795, on April 20th of 1795, James Madison sat down, the father of the Constitution, sat down to write some thoughts on war. And why, when he was shepherding the Constitution through the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, why they explicitly, in Article 1 of the Constitution, gave only to Congress the power to make war. And it requires a vote of both the House and the Senate. Why did they do that? And he wrote, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other enemy to public liberty. He goes on to say, and he's talking about how when presidents go to war, and it had not happened in the United States at this point, 1795, but when a president goes to war, his power is increased. Madison goes on to say, in war, too, the discretionary power of the president, the executive, is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. I mean, let's be clear, war is legalized murder. And what usually follows on the back end of it, and of course, along with legalized murder, there's massive legalized property destruction. And what follows on the end of it is all kinds of awful stuff, including widespread rape. And we're starting to get now reports about widespread rape in Ukraine going on by Russian soldiers. But Madison continued. He says the same malignant aspect in republicanism. Now, keep in mind, republicanism that was the form of government that we created. They didn't call it democracy back then. They called it republicanism or a republic. The same malignant, and there's a reason for that, which is a whole nother rant. The same malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manners and of morals engendered by both. Engendered by, in other words, the war creates an opportunity for people to get rich, and through fraud, and that leads to a degeneracy of manners and morals across the nation. No nation, James Madison concluded, the father of the Constitution, no nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And then he went on to say, we think we've figured this out. We think we've figured out a way to stop war. We will require that the body that is closest to the people, the only body in the federal government that is elected directly by the individuals in the states and in some cases at the county level, the House of Representatives and the Senate, must make this decision, period. He said, the reader shall judge on this subject for himself. The Constitution expressly and exclusively vests in the legislature the power of declaring a state of war. The separation of the power of declaring war from that of conducting it is wisely contrived to exclude the danger of it being declared for the sake of it being conducted, which is exactly what Bush did. He goes on to say the separation of the power of raising armies from the power of commanding them is intended to prevent the raising of armies for the sake of commanding them. But now we've had 70 years of this stuff, 50 years anyway, of police action in Vietnam and authorization to use military force in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we need to go back to say, to the founders' wisdom in this regard. The founders were brilliant in some areas, stupid in others. We all know that. But this one, they got right. And we need to go back and say, sorry, no more authorizations to use military force, no more after-the-fact certifications of police actions. Yes, we can help out our friends, in Ukraine. We can ship them weaponry and things like that. But if one American troop is going to go into another country and engage in active hostilities, Congress needs to sign off on it. Congress needs to declare war. Otherwise, who's the next president going to be, right? If you get a Republican president from one of these Trumpies who like George W. Bush and Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, for that matter, views war as a way to increase their popularity. I frankly don't think that was the case with LBJ, but it may have been. It certainly was the case with Nixon. He got reelected in '72 saying he was going to win with honor. Remember that? This is how we stop it.